So the idea of the Big Bang Theory is that the universe had a beginning somewhere in time, and that we can determine what the universe was like as early as 1/60th of a second, or 10 undecillionths of a second after the Big Bang. Of course, the problem that we run into back then is that there was no back then, and space and time were both created back then, and since space and time were both created back then, there was no back then. So how do we reconcile the fact that we're looking back in time to see something that is completely independent of time? I don't know. I'm not a physicist, and I'm not say all those geniuses are stupid or anything. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and see if I can express in words my concept. It's all pretty confusing, so if at the end of this you think that you understand what I've been talking about, I think it's probably because you weren't really listening. But no offense. So, if there was no back then how do we know that we can look back then from now and see what back then was like when there was no back then? Back then, the back then that they're talking about before back then, or independently of any back then, because there was no back then, would have been a non-duality, would have been a singularity, meaning that there was no differentiation at all. So if we're looking at a singularity, then that sounds a bit like Wuji, or non-duality. And non-duality is a state that we actually strive for in meditation. We strive for emptiness or the void, and there are those who say that they can attain that state. So if they can attain that state, if that's true, then we shouldn't be looking back then for back then at all. For one thing, the past is not what it used to be. Here we have a notion of the universe. We live in what we call a three-dimensional universe. So we have we can measure it in terms of down and left and right and forward and back and so on. Those are 3 dimensions. So we live in 3-dimensional space, and we often see ourselves as in a 3-dimensional space with time going by from the past to the future, and we're right here in the present. So if this is true, then we have space and time here, but outside of space and time, if there is no space and time, how do we understand exactly what we're talking about? So let's look at it from a different point of view. Don't think of time as being something that is flowing by us. We think of time as being another dimension in space. And if time is another dimension in space, then we are actually moving through that space as well. So let's think of the universe in a timeline. Let's think of a timeline that starts over there and ends up over there. Go from the past to the present and to the future. Now, that's a 3-dimensional universe that exists at every point in time. So if we are in a 3-dimensional universe that exists in every point in time, and we are the ones who are actually moving. So we don't think about the wind as moving, we don't think about the cars as moving, we don't think about our bodies as moving. Instead, we think about our awareness moving from one point in the universe to another. Just like I'd move from one room in a house to another room in the house, I am moving from one point in time to another point in time. And just like that room in the house is going to be there if I could go back there, and maybe I can, but will that room in the house be the same if I go back there? Maybe that room in the house has changed since I've been there. How do we know that the past, where we were, that point in the universe, is the same as it was when we left it? We don't know. Somebody else may have come along and changed things. So if you think about this then as time being the 4th dimension, and we only have a limited understanding of the 4th dimension in the same way that somebody who only understood 2 dimensions would not understand the 3rd. For instance, if this were an infinitely thin dimension, imagine that instead of being very, very thin, it had no thickness at all. It were infinitely thin. So if this line were infinitely thin, this would represent 2 dimensions. And if our awareness was only of that particular 2 dimensions, then what would happen if a 3-dimensional thing, object, consciousness, were to pass through it? In a 3-dimensional universe, we would see a ball, of course, moving through that. Or, in fact, we would experience our awareness going from the universe where the ball was here to the universe where the ball was there. But, in fact, the 2-dimensional awareness doesn't experience it that way. Instead, the 2-dimensional awareness will experience a dot, theoretically, a tiny little dot. Then the dot becomes a circle, and the circle becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller and then becomes a dot and disappears. That would be like something appearing in our reality and then fading away and disappearing. Like somebody being, a consciousness coming into our reality and existing as a human being and then leaving our reality. So is that consciousness not there anymore, or is it just gone somewhere else? We don't know. We don't have that kind of understanding of that awareness. But, so here we have 3 dimensions moving through 4 dimensions. Well, maybe there are more than 4 dimensions. Maybe if we go along this timeline, for instance, we can go this way along the timeline, but maybe we want to make a change. We want to go to this universe instead and go along there. So rather than going, from the past to the future in a predictable way, we generate some energy which changes our momentum, which allows us to go up there, and we go there. Now, this, according to some people, is very easy. It's sort of like when you're riding a motorcycle. All you have to do is look in the direction that you want to go, and you go there. People who teach positive thinking say that if you think positively, then you can change your reality. Well, that's true, but there is such a thing as inertia as well. And often what people end up doing from a martial arts point of view is they get attached to the thing that they're trying not to be instead of focusing their mind on where they want to go. Where the mind goes, the chi follows, and then the body follows. So the mind moves the chi moves the body, and the universe follows along. So you have all of these possible dimensions. These are 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions. Who knows what the math, somebody said to me once that according to the mathematics, there has to be at least 10 dimensions. I'm suggesting there may not be a limit to the number of dimensions, just like there may not actually be a beginning in time. However, let's think of this not as being 2-dimensional, but as being non-dimensional. Think of this paper, this 2-dimensional frame, as being no dimensions at all. So there is no duality. And imagine that this ball represents duality. So this duality is going to intersect that non-duality. And what's going to happen first is the separation. You're going to experience the separation of yin and yang. Now the separation of yin and yang is done by qi. So if I were to hold a ball and I drop the ball and it falls, then that's qi. If the ball bounces back up, that's qi. If I drop the ball and it doesn't fall, that's also qi. That's also energy. So in the Tai Chi symbol, you'll see a line between yin and yang. That line is where qi is. We don't know what it is. We know what it does. It does work. It has the potential to do work. It defines things. It differentiates between yin and yang. But it's not a thing, because things are defined by qi. But anyway, so you have yin and yang and the holy qi. So duality intersects non-duality. The first thing that happens is the experience of energy. There will be huge amounts of energy as yin and yang separate. And then as the awareness becomes immersed in duality, that duality expands and the energy, the separation of it is farther away. But inside there will be a whole bunch of things that, the edges of the duality will get farther away. This is just sort of scratching the surface of what I've been thinking about lately. But so imagine this duality goes in here. Imagine it's not a solid ball either. Maybe it's like Swiss cheese and there are little holes in it. So there's duality and non-duality. Maybe there are little gaps where the whole thing disappears and then vanishes. Maybe it's not a ball. Maybe the universe comes into creation like this. Maybe it's a cylinder. Maybe it's like a toilet paper tube. And it goes kaboom! Lots of reality, lots of duality, and then no duality. Just all of a sudden gone. Maybe it's not going to be a gradual fade away into non-duality. Maybe it just isn't, then isn't. So, now, I'm not saying that we can describe non-duality in terms of duality. I'm not. This is Laozi's point. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. But, what you going to do?